It's great to be here. Great to be able to gather in this way. If this is your first time, I know viewers were here last week, a few new faces this week. It's just really wonderful to be able to gather. And we're going to be going through the book of Genesis over the course of the next 6 months, the Lord willing. And we started last week in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. And we're basically thinking, certainly for this first part in Genesis, about this life, the life story of Abraham. And we said last week that the predominant theme that comes through as you read through the story of Abraham is this sense of journey. Here is a man who's on a journey. We certainly pick that up today in the passage that Rebecca read to us earlier. And we said last week, in some ways, that's kind of ironic, because the one thing most of us aren't doing at the moment is going on journeys. And yet, although we're not going on geographical journeys like Abraham potentially, we are going on a spiritual journey into the unknown over these weeks together. And last week we just thought about three aspects of Abraham's journey. We thought about the sense of being an unexpected journey. God meets with Abraham, as it were, out of the blue. He doesn't come to know God and encounter God through his family background. His dad was not a believer. He comes to encounter God personally for himself and gets launched out into this unexpected journey. Then we said it was not just an unexpected journey, but it was a journey of faith. God tells him to go, but he doesn't tell him where he's going. And we were thinking last week that so often in life we want the journey of faith to be a bit like Google Maps. We want to know all of the details, the destination, the time it's going to take to get there, and all of the hold-ups along the way. We want to see the whole picture, and yet we said last week, often the journey of faith is more like my Garmin or my bicycle. We don't see the whole picture, we just know what the next direction, the next turning is. And actually we indeed said it's a lot more actually like going on a journey with a friend. You don't need to know where you're going. You don't need to know how long it's going to take to get there. You just need to keep in step, keep up, as it were. I was thinking about that verse, we're to keep in step with the Spirit. That's the journey that we're called to. And then we said last week it was a journey of blessing, and God's purpose in choosing Abraham and then his descendants, the nation of Israel, was not because he didn't care about the rest of the world, but because he did, and he wanted to include the world. And God blesses us, not just so we can be blessed, but so that that can overflow to others. And there's three more things about this sense of journey that we pick up from this next bit of chapter 12 that we can unpack today together. And the first bit is this: it's a journey of obedience. Look at verse 4, how it starts out. Verse 4, Abraham went as the Lord had told him. Abraham went as the Lord had told him. So he obeys God's command, because the command in verse 1 was, go from your country, your people, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Have you ever stopped to think, like, Abraham's act of obedience there was a huge step. In one sense, it was a small step. He just set out on a journey. But actually, think of what that was to lead to. All of the promises of God that were going to come through Abraham, to his family, to his descendants, to Jesus, to the world. And then think of what would have happened if he hadn't taken that first step of obedience. And so often, great things start with steps of obedience, don't they? Where God calls us to do something, to step out in some way. And actually there is that sense which God needs to direct us, but also we need to obey. Now, when you read this at first, it gives the impression that God says go, and Abraham just goes. But actually, if you look a little bit closer into the text, it maybe isn't quite as straightforward as that. So verse 4, Abraham went as the Lord had told him. Now, when had the Lord told Abraham to go? Well, if you're using the app, you won't see it, because unfortunately verse 1's not on it. But let me read verse 1. The Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country. So even in verse 1, it's not God present tense saying go. It's a reminder of what God had already told Abraham at some point in the past to do. Okay? Now bear that in mind, because back in chapter 11, you see a little bit of the context as we looked at last week. Verse 31 of chapter 11 says, Terah, that was Abraham's father, took Abraham, his grandson Lot, his son Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and the wife of his son Abraham, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. So it seems that this journey that Abraham is on actually began quite a number of years before with his father. But interestingly, they never got to Canaan. They got stuck in this place called Haran. And it's only when his father dies, chapter 12, he then continues that journey to the place that God has called him to go to. And that got me thinking this week. Isn't that interesting? Abraham was called to go, but it seems that he got sidetracked on the journey. It's a bit like yesterday. I went out for a cycle ride, and I got to the top of a hill, and there was a lovely bench looking over this gorgeous view. And it was a very steep hill, so I thought to myself, well, I'll just stop here for a few minutes. And a few minutes became 10 minutes, became half an hour. And I got a bit sidetracked. Now, I would like to say that it's because I was thinking about this morning's talk. But that sense in which we can get sidetracked on the journey. Now, in this case, what was it? Actually, it was potentially his father. And it got me thinking, actually, there can be situations or sometimes contexts in which we can get stopped from pursuing God's call in our lives. And potentially for Abraham, it was actually his family, his dad in this case, that held him back from continuing that journey of faith that God had called him to. And then it got me thinking, because actually so often in life, God maybe is calling us to start out on that journey of faith. Or maybe he's calling us to continue into new areas of that journey of faith with him. And often the things that can hold us back are actually the people around us, potentially, can't they? So I think of a conversation I once had with a girl who was really wrestling with the call of God to start following Jesus. And yet for her, as a Muslim, her family were a huge, huge, huge barrier for that. I don't underestimate that at all. It may not be our parents, it could be a spouse, it could be others who are holding us back, potentially, from continuing to follow God's call in our lives. But the wonderful thing is, although Abraham did get sidetracked, he didn't get stuck. Actually, that continued. And wonderfully, maybe in our Christian lives, there have been times, maybe for weeks, maybe for months, over this period of lockdown and weirdness, we feel like our spiritual journey has come to a halt. And the encouragement is it can carry on again. We don't need to stay sitting down. We don't need to stay stuck. Maybe for some, it's been stuck for years. We started following God, and then we've got stuck, as it were, in Haran. And God's saying, okay, I want you to carry on that journey. I don't need to stay where you've got stuck. Time to carry on, time to move on. So that's the first thing, was a journey of obedience. The second thing that really struck me from this, it was a journey of encounters. A journey of encounters. Just look at verse 6 and 7. Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abraham. And he built an altar there. So here he is, he's walking along, and he gets to this tree, and the Lord appears to Abraham by a tree. And I was thinking, like, that's interesting. And then I carried on reading, actually, into chapter 13. If you get to the end of chapter 13, verse 18, it says, Abraham went to live near the great trees of Mamre, where he pitched his tents and built an altar to the Lord. So the story of Abraham is a story of him encountering God, building these altars by these trees. And I thought, that's kind of interesting, because here we are, sitting under the great trees of Latimer Minster, meeting with the Lord, building an altar, as it were. But isn't that what we long for? We would long to encounter the Lord. And we have a God who's wild, who meets us in the wild. And that's the story of Abraham, not God meeting in nice, neat, organized ways, but meeting him by trees, meeting him in the open air. And again, just as we were praying this morning about our gathering, this really struck me. We always want to kind of contain and organize God, don't we? And it reminded me of that time in the New Testament as we were praying this morning of the Transfiguration, and how Peter and his two friends are called to go up the mountain with Jesus. And then as they're on the mountain, Jesus is transfigured. They have this incredible encounter as they see something of the glory of Jesus. And they're joined by Moses, and they're joined by Elijah. And the first thing Peter says, because he's a little bit stuck, he's like, shall we put up a tent? And I thought, isn't that interesting? He wants to kind of contain this moment, organize it, put structures around it. And I was thinking, like, we don't even have a tent anymore that we can meet in. All we've got are trees, and yet the Bible says that's okay. You can meet with God anywhere, and our longing is that we meet with God here. That as we come and as we listen, as we worship, that this wood would become a place of encounter with God, just like that tree at Moreh was. It's a journey of encounters, and my prayer is that we encounter the Lord as we go along this journey. And then lastly, quickly, it was a journey, we said, of encounters, a journey of obedience. It was also a journey of hope. Looking at verse 7. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So Abraham is now in Canaan. And God says, to your offspring I'm going to give this land. Now, just take a moment and think, that must have seemed incredibly unlikely in that particular moment in time. I mean, number one, the land of Canaan was full of Canaanites, okay? Their enemy. They weren't in a land that they possessed. They were strangers in a land that they didn't own. A land that was dangerous, probably. But also, Abraham is 75 years old and his wife is childless. And God says to him in the middle of this land, your descendants are going to inherit this land. In that particular moment, it must have seemed incredible for Abraham to consider that that would ever become true. And yet it did, didn't it? Abraham was, as we're going to see later on in the story, to have descendants. But actually, Abraham never lived to see those descendants inherit the land. He lived to see those promises begin to be fulfilled, and yet he never lived to see all of God's promises fulfilled in his lifetime on earth. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, it is the same with us, isn't it, in the Christian life? God has given us, if we are Christians, incredible and amazing promises. And in our lives as Christians, we begin to see some of those promises become fulfilled. And yet, we only see them begin to be fulfilled. There is so much more yet that we long for, that we will never see this side of heaven. And yet we have those promises. And in the midst of what seemed incredibly unlikely, God gives these promises to Abraham. And so Abraham was able to live and journey in hope of where things were heading. I don't know about you, as I've reflected over the last couple of weeks, our emotions on the current kind of political, global situation are probably quite volatile at the moment, aren't they? Okay, so a couple of weeks ago I was feeling a little bit optimistic. I was thinking, yes, we're kind of heading in the right direction. Things are opening up, we're having a little bit more normality, everything's fine, and then I wake up this week and I think, oh my goodness. And we can joke about it, but actually I've had a great sense of despair at times this week. As I've just thought about our country, our lives, the uncertainties, and that sense that we now seem to be turning around and going in a direction that I really don't want to go in. And isn't life like that? We oscillate between times of optimism and times of despair, depending on the circumstances that we see immediately around us. I remember someone once saying, they said, in the Christian life, we're neither to be optimists nor to be pessimists. We're not to live with optimism or despair, but we're to be people of hope. And I found that so helpful. Some of us are naturally optimistic, some of us are naturally pessimistic, but we're called to be people of hope. And that hope is not based on, thank goodness, the latest government directive. The numbers of cases, the numbers of deaths, whatever. You know, our ultimate hope as Christians is based on the promises of God, and they don't change. And life is tough in a broken world, isn't it? It's going to be tough for Abraham, as we'll see in his journey. But he held on to those promises. And he looked forward to the fulfillment of those promises. And yes, we will see wonderful promises fulfilled in our lifetime as we journey with God, but also we long for that day, don't we? When they'll be ultimately fulfilled. I've just found myself doing that this week. I think as I look at COVID and all that causes, I just think, oh God, I long for the day when there'll be no viruses, no deaths, no hospitals. I long for that day. And then as I get frustrated with government directives, I think I long for the day when the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Mighty God, Prince of Peace. He's the leader that I want, and I'm not going to get frustrated with him. So it delivers hope, the people of hope, on the journey. A journey of obedience. Maybe we need to keep on that journey. Maybe we've got a bit stuck, and we're being called to get going again. Maybe we've never started. We're being called to get going, whatever the cost. Whether it's family that are holding us back, fears of the unknown, to start that journey of obedience, and then that journey of hope. And along the way, let's pray that the Lord encounters us under the great trees of Latimer, and that this becomes a meeting place with God.